Welcome, travelers of Middle-earth, to a journey through time and legend. Today we set sail for Númenor, the fabled island kingdom gifted to men by the Valar. But this is not a tale of its fall. Nay, it is a tale of its heights, its glory, and its wisdom. To master the lore of Númenor, one must know its greatest king, Tar-Minas-Tir, whose name means Tower Watcher. In his reign, the might of Númenor shone brightest, and through him we glimpsed the true power and purpose of the Dunedain. Let us embark upon this voyage into history, where the echoes of the past still whisper upon the waves. In the year 1476 of the Second Age, Tar-Minas-Tir ascended the scepter of Númenor, inheriting a kingdom at the peak of its strength. A descendant of Elros, the first king of Númenor and brother of Elrond, Minas-Tir's bloodline was noble beyond measure, mingling the gifts of elves and men. But Númenor was at a crossroads. Though its wealth grew, a shadow was stirring in Middle-earth. Sauron, the Dark Lord, was rising again, and the elves of Eriador, led by King Gil-galad, faced annihilation. The fate of the West hung in the balance, and Tar-Minas-Tir stood at the helm of history. His heart, though burdened with the pride of Númenor's might, was still inclined toward friendship with the Eldar. He honored the old alliances and sent a great armada to Middle-earth. In the year 1700 of the Second Age, his fleets arrived in Lindon with Númenor's greatest warriors, and together with Gil-galad they broke Sauron's armies upon the shores. It was the first great defeat of the Dark Lord, forcing him to retreat to the east. This triumph cemented Númenor's place as the supreme naval power of the world, unmatched on the waves or the battlefield. Yet, from the seeds of victory grew the first roots of arrogance that would, in time, doom the realm. The Númenorians began to see themselves as masters, not protectors. They came to Middle-earth not as allies, but as rulers. Tar-Minas-Tir himself, though wise, was not immune to this change. He longed for immortality, envying the elves who would outlive even the mightiest of men. Though he never defied the Valar openly, the desires that festered in his heart would later consume his descendants. This, too, was part of his legacy, the first whisper of the doom that would befall Númenor in the days of Ar-Pharazôn. But let us not rush toward the end. Tar-Minas-Tir was, above all, a king of knowledge. He built great halls of lore, chronicling the wisdom of Númenor's forebears. He strengthened the guilds of shipwrights, expanding the fleets that would one day reach the distant shores of Middle-earth and beyond. And though he coveted the gifts of the Eldar, he did not forsake their friendship. In him we see the last great ruler who balanced wisdom and might, a beacon before the gathering storm. Yet for all his wisdom, Tar-Minas-Tir was not untouched by the burdens of kingship. The Númenorians, once content in their paradise, now turned their eyes eastward with growing hunger. The rich lands of Middle-earth lay before them, and though they had come as saviors in the war against Sauron, they soon saw themselves as rightful lords. The great fleets of Númenor, once the guardians of the free peoples, became symbols of dominion. The ports of Middle-earth, from the Grey Havens to the shores of the south, felt the weight of Númenorian ambition. And yet Minas-Tir himself walked the fine line between power and restraint, always mindful of the warnings of the Valar. It was in his later years that Tar-Minas-Tir's heart grew heavy with regret. He had witnessed the greatness of Númenor, had seen its warriors stand beside the elves in triumph, but he had also seen the first glimmers of a darker path. He had hoped to strengthen his people, to make them wise as well as mighty. But even he could not silence the growing restlessness of his lords and captains. They murmured of greater conquest, of seizing dominion not only over the lands of Middle-earth, but, in time, perhaps even over the fates decreed by the powers beyond the sea. Minas-Tir, who had once looked across the waves with wonder, now feared what lay ahead. And so, in the year 1731 of the Second Age, Tar-Minas-Tir did what few kings of Númenor had done before him. He laid down the scepter. Though Númenorian kings often ruled until the end of their natural days, Minas-Tir saw the weight of his reign pressing upon his soul. He passed the rule to his son, Tar-Siriatan, a man of great ambition, but lesser wisdom. Minister withdrew from the throne, seeking solitude in the high towers of Armenelos, gazing westward toward the forbidden shores of Aman. Did he long for the grace of the Valar? Did he repent of the pride that had begun to stir within Númenor? None can say for certain. But in the echoes of history, we hear a lament, a warning carried upon the winds of time. For Tar Siriaten, who succeeded him, did not share his father's reverence for the past. Where Minister had sought friendship with the elves, Siriaten sought dominion over men. The fleets that once carried warriors to aid Lindon now returned as conquerors, bearing riches plundered from the lands of Middle-earth. Minister, now an old man, could only watch as the kingdom he had sought to strengthen began to twist into something else. Something that, in time, would lead to ruin. Yet let us not forget that in Tar Minastir we see the last of the great Númenorian kings who still honored the ways of old. He was not blind to the coming storm, but neither could he halt its course. He lived long, as was the gift of his people, and when he finally passed, the light of Númenor had already begun to dim, though few yet realized it. His name remains in the annals of the Dunedain, a ruler of might and wisdom, standing upon the precipice between Númenor's glory and its downfall. As Tar Ministir's days waned, so too did the delicate balance he had sought to preserve. Though he had ensured Númenor's supremacy upon the seas, the cost of that supremacy was beginning to show. The hearts of his people, once filled with awe and gratitude for the Valar, now burned with a new hunger, one that even he, in his wisdom, could not quench. Under his son, Tar Siriaten, the fleets no longer sailed only in friendship or in war against Sauron's shadow, but for wealth, power, and dominion. It was said that Tar Siriaten himself hastened his father's departure, pressing him to surrender the scepter before his will could sway Númenor back to restraint. And so, Minister became the first of many kings to witness the slow, inevitable turning of Númenor's heart away from the west. It is written that, in his later years, Tar Minastir would climb to the highest towers of Armenelos and gaze upon the western horizon, where the undying lands lay beyond reach. His was a sorrowful longing, not merely for immortality, but for a wisdom lost. He had fought for Númenor's greatness, and yet he saw that greatness tainted by pride. The gift of the Valar, the long life of the Dunedain, became to many a burden rather than a blessing. The shadow of death, though distant, loomed ever closer. Even the nobles sought to defy it, and Ministir's own descendants would go further than he ever dared, seeking in vain to wrest from the divine that which was never meant for mortal hands. Yet, in the lands of Middle-earth, Tar Minastir's legacy was not forgotten. The elves of Lindon, who had stood with him against Sauron's might, remembered him as the last great friend of the Eldar among Númenor's kings. For long years they held in reverence the memory of that alliance, even as Númenor's captains grew cold and haughty. In the realms of men, too, his name endured. Though many of the Númenorian settlements that had once flourished in Middle-earth later fell into tyranny, there were still those among the faithful, the elf friends, who looked back to Ministir's reign as a time of nobility, when Númenor stood as a beacon rather than a conqueror. But history is often cruel in its unfolding. As the ages passed, the legacy of Tar Minastir was buried beneath the weight of Númenor's later deeds. His triumphs, his wisdom, and his warnings were cast aside as mere preludes to greater conquests. The lords of Númenor, with their vast ships and mighty hosts, believed themselves unchallenged, unassailable. They had driven Sauron to retreat once. What then could stand against them? They saw themselves as masters of the world, forgetting the humility that had once been their strength. And thus the doom of Númenor, though distant, was already drawing nigh. Yet there is something else to be gleaned from Ministir's tale. Though he was a king of great power, he was also a man who knew fear. Not fear of battle or of losing his kingdom, but of losing its very soul. He saw in his people the seeds of their own downfall, and though he strove to delay it, he knew he could not turn back the tide. His story is not one of arrogance, nor of blind folly, but of a man caught between past and future. knowing the cost of wisdom, yet powerless to make his people heed it. And in this, perhaps, he is the most tragic of Númenor's kings. Not because he fell, but because he foresaw the fall and could do nothing to prevent it. In the years after Tar Ministir's passing, Númenor continued to grow in might, but it was a different kind of strength, one tainted by ambition. The fleets that had once sailed to aid Middle-earth now came to claim it. Tar Siriatan, Ministir's son and successor, was the first to burden Númenor with a hunger for tribute, demanding wealth and submission from the lands of men who dwelt in the east and south. The shadow of dominion, which Ministir had feared but never embraced, was now cast upon Middle-earth, and it would only grow darker with each passing reign. Yet even as Númenor changed, the echoes of Tar Ministir's legacy remained. The elf friends, those who still revered the Valar and the wisdom of the Eldar, remembered him as the last of the great kings who sought peace rather than power. These were the same faithful who, generations later, would stand against the madness of Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor. And in the end, it was they who would carry forward the true spirit of Númenor, not in the palaces of Arminelos, nor in the great warships of the Western Fleet, but in the line of Elendil, who would one day flee the doomed island and establish the realms of Arnor and Gondor in Middle-earth. But what of Tar Ministir himself? It is said that before he died, he spoke of Númenor's fate in words few dared to repeat. Whether in warning or lament, none can say. But his final years were spent in quiet contemplation, his eyes still turning westward toward the hidden lands of Aman. Did he foresee the downfall of Númenor? Did he know that the power he had wielded to save Middle-earth would in the end become the very force that doomed his people? Such questions are lost to time, but the weight of his reign cannot be ignored. He was both the savior of Middle-earth and the herald of Númenor's pride, a ruler who walked the thin line between wisdom and ambition. And so, Tar Ministir passed from the world, his bones laid to rest in the tombs of Armenelos. But the lessons of his life remained for those who would listen. He had seen both the strength and the folly of Númenor, and in his reign we glimpse the heart of the island kingdom before it turned fully to shadow. His was an age of grandeur, of victory, of friendship with the Eldar, but also an age where the first cracks in Númenor's foundation began to form. He did not live to see them widen into ruin, but he knew, perhaps better than any who came after, that Númenor's fate was already set upon a path from which there would be no return. Yet even in darkness there is always a light. Though Númenor would fall, its legacy was not wholly lost. The Dunedain who came to Middle-earth carried with them the wisdom of their forebears, and in the White Tree of Gondor, a scion of Nimloth, there remained a symbol of what Númenor had once been. Tar Ministir may not have been able to save his people from their own pride, but through those who remembered him, his spirit endured. And in the long years to come, when the shadow of Sauron once more fell upon the world, it was the heirs of Númenor who stood against him, not as conquerors, but as protectors, as Tar Ministir had once been. And so the tale of Tar Ministir comes to its end, but his shadow lingers over the histories of Middle-earth. He was a king of contradictions, a ruler who wielded power yet feared its consequences, a champion of the Eldar whose actions sowed the first seeds of Númenor's downfall. His legacy is neither one of unblemished glory nor of outright ruin, but of a kingdom standing upon the precipice, uncertain whether to embrace wisdom or fall into pride. In this he was the last of his kind, the final king of Númenor who truly sought harmony before the long descent began. In later years, the Númenorian lords who ruled in Middle-earth built great fortresses, carving their will into the land with stone and steel. They demanded tribute, set themselves above the lesser men, and forgot the humility that had once been their greatest strength. And yet, there were always those among them who looked back to the days of Tar Ministir and wondered, what if they had heeded his unspoken warnings? What if Númenor had remained a friend to Middle-earth, rather than its master? What if the pride that festered in his son Tar Siriatan had never taken root? But history is unrelenting, and the path of Númenor was set long before its final king sailed against the ban of the Valar. And so, when Númenor fell, When the seas rose in wrath to swallow the mightiest kingdom of men, it was not the great armadas, nor the towering citadels that endured, but the memory of those who had once ruled wisely. In the ships of Elendil and his sons, the last remnants of the faithful carried the true spirit of Númenor to Middle-earth. Gondor and Arnor, the kingdoms they founded, were not built upon conquest, but upon the ideals that Tar Minestir had sought to uphold. It was no accident that when Gondor reached its height, its people still spoke of their old allegiance to the Eldar, still looked westward to the sea, as Minestir once had. His influence, though diminished, still shaped the destiny of the Dunedain, long after his own island had perished beneath the waves. So what, then, can we learn from Tar Minestir? He was not the most famous of Númenor's kings, nor the most powerful. His name is not spoken with the reverence of Elros, nor the infamy of Ar-Pharazôn. But he was a ruler who stood at the turning of the tide, who saw what was coming yet could not turn the course of fate. He reminds us that the mightiest civilizations do not fall in a single day, nor through a single act, but through the slow erosion of wisdom, the gradual embrace of arrogance. His reign is a testament to the truth that even the noblest of men are not immune to the passage of time and the weight of their own desires. And yet there is hope in his story. For though Númenor was lost, its legacy did not end with its ruin. It lived on in the white tree that stood in Minas Tirith, in the line of Isildur and Aragorn, in the resilience of the Dunedain who never forgot what they had once been. Tar Minestir's kingdom may have faded into legend, but the lessons of his reign remain, waiting for those who would listen. And as long as the waves whisper upon the shores of Middle-earth, the memory of Númenor's greatest king endures. Watching, as he once did, from the heights of his tower toward the distant west,